Hi, I'm Martin Sheen. My real name is Ramon Antonio Gerardo Estevez. Father Bud Kieser. I can't remember a specific time, place, or day of meeting, but I knew his reputation, and when I met him, he was the guy, all right. I heard about this giant, this handsome 6'8" German with the wide smile and the deep voice. And very often at the end of the shows, Bud would come on and give just a brief homily. He was like a very clear, recognizable figure to the company, you know. He was in sight. It was like doing a little play in a week's time. So you got to rehearse and form a full character. So you formed a community, you know, with players, and many of them you'd see again and again, you know, because I say he practically had a company of players. There were some wonderful, wonderful actors. And they were always so pleased to do it because you didn't get that opportunity. It wasn't like any of the other television shows. You didn't get that much rehearsal time in regular television, and you didn't do it all at once after a week of rehearsal. Now, of course, it's kind of like the preferred way. They do these sitcoms. They rehearse for a week and then they film in front of a live audience. And it was great fun. And you got a chance to play characters that you normally wouldn't do. And I want to say they always had a moral theme, but that's not accurate. It was a moral theme, but it was non-denominational. You know, he didn't beat people over the head with how they should react or how they ought to feel. It was like it just presented a very human situation in a realistic setting, and sometimes a very poetic setting, a very humorous setting. But it was always about being human. It was about being vulnerable. It was about being of service. It was about being generous and self-effacing. And that was always a welcome relief over all the other stuff you had to do on television back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the whole time I played, where you had to rob somebody or kill somebody or do something awful. I do remember I felt uncomfortable playing it, you know, because I wasn't among the faithful and I didn't feel I was the right guy, you know. I probably would have played it much differently 3 years later. I would have had a sincere affinity and respect, and I think a far more compassionate understanding of the church and the clergy. I would have been far more pro-clergy in 81 than I would have been in 78. I'm only guessing. So I was gone from the church, the regular church, for quite a while, and I came back very strong and very committed in 1981, and he called me up, and he'd heard that I was a practicing Catholic after all these years. But I had a wonderful chat with him, and I'll never forget bragging about my reconversion and how happy I was. And he looked at me and he smiled. He said, "Well, you know, Martin, this is the honeymoon." Was he right? Because, you know, anything worth having is going to cost you. It got very costly. I would never change it. The only regret I have about coming back to the church is I didn't come back sooner. I keep my my missal open and my rosary in pocket, and my love for the faith. You know, I have trouble with the church. I think we should have. It's an organization. It's run by men primarily, and it has its flaws. It's human, but it's a universal community. Catholic means universal. So that, I love that about the faith. Bud was very, very deeply moved by the poor, and he served the poor, and he reflected his love and his service in the work he did, in his films and television shows, and his life. He lived a very sacred life on a public kind of stage. You know, he just seemed so young and vital to have died when he did, and yet there was that sense that, you know, he would never die. And I had the honor of being in his presence very close to the end, and it was a blessing. I remember gathering with some few actors and friends and around his bed and praying and singing. been a day or two before he passed. You know, I mean, he was an actor, but he wasn't. He was a priest, but he wasn't. He was a producer, but he wasn't. He was all of those things, and not a single one of them. He was bigger than life, and I don't mean that as a pun, but he was.